Denise, step away from the desk.
What is this?
You know exactly why we're here.
No, I don't.
We traced the transfers.
What transfers?
For nearly 14 years, Denise Reed was one of the most respected public defenders in the county. Clients trusted her with their freedom, and judges trusted her professionalism. But investigators would eventually allege that Reed was doing far more than defending, accused drug traffickers. What they uncovered threatened to expose a corruption scheme hidden inside the justice system itself.
$300,000 moved through accounts linked to your clients. Black public defender Denise Carter, you're under arrest.
On most weekday mornings, the security checkpoint inside the Metro County Justice Center looked exactly the same. Sheriff's deputies stood beside metal detectors. Attorneys shuffled through carrying worn case files. Court clerks balanced coffee cups and stacks of paperwork. The fluorescent lights above the lobby buzzed softly while the HVAC system pushed cold air through the aging government building. Among the familiar faces moving through those halls was Denise Reed. At 42 years old, Black public defender Denise Reed had become one of the most recognizable attorneys in Metro County. Judges knew her by name. Prosecutors expected to see her across the courtroom several times a week. Bailiffs nodded when she walked past. For more than a decade, Reed had built a reputation as the lawyer assigned to some of the county's most difficult criminal cases. Most involved narcotics trafficking. Others involved weapons charges, organized criminal activity, and repeat offenders facing decades in prison. The work was demanding. The hours were worse. Public defenders rarely received the recognition given to private attorneys. The salary was modest compared to the caseload. Yet Reed seemed to thrive in the environment. According to employment records, she joined the Metro County Public Defender's Office in 2011, after graduating from law school and spending several years handling misdemeanor defense work. Supervisors described her as intelligent, prepared, and unusually comfortable inside a courtroom. One retired judge would later recall that Reed had a talent for remaining calm under pressure. Even during heated hearings, she rarely raised her voice. She spoke deliberately. She listened carefully, and she understood how to connect with juries. That reputation earned her promotions. By 2024, Reed was handling some of the most complex narcotics cases moving through the county system. Her office sat on the third floor of the Justice Center, a cramped workspace filled with aging desktop computers, overflowing file cabinets, and shelves packed with legal binders. Most days began before sunrise. Court schedules, jail visits, client meetings, motion hearings, plea negotiations, and emergency filings consumed nearly every hour. For many attorneys, the workload would have been overwhelming. For Reed, it appeared routine, at least on the surface. Many of her clients came from ongoing investigations conducted by local narcotics units and regional drug task forces. Names like Darnell Hayes, Victor Morales, and Terrence Coleman frequently appeared on her calendar. Each had been accused of significant trafficking offenses. Each faced lengthy prison exposure. Representing individuals accused of serious crimes did not make Reed unusual. It was her job. The criminal justice system depended on defense attorneys willing to represent unpopular clients. Inside the courthouse, nobody viewed those relationships as suspicious. In fact, Reed's willingness to take difficult cases was often seen as evidence of her professionalism. Colleagues described her as ambitious. Some described her as exceptionally connected. Others simply viewed her as a lawyer who understood how the system worked. Yet small observations began accumulating around her. Nothing dramatic, nothing criminal, just details. One coworker remembered Reed arriving in a recently purchased luxury SUV, despite earning a government salary that generally fell between $80,000 and $90,000 annually. Another recalled hearing casual conversations about expensive weekend trips. A courthouse employee later mentioned seeing Reed wearing a watch that appeared significantly more expensive than anything she had worn in previous years. None of these observations generated formal complaints. People notice things in workplaces, then they move on. That is usually where the story ends. Inside the public defender's office, there was no shortage of explanations. Reed had no children. She had practiced law for years. Maybe she had investments. Maybe she inherited money. Maybe her spouse earned a substantial income. Nobody knew. And nobody asked many questions. The legal profession is filled with people who value privacy. As months passed, the observations remained isolated. One administrative employee quietly wondered how Reed seemed to afford frequent upgrades, while most public defenders complained about stagnant salaries. Another coworker joked that she must have discovered a better financial planner than everyone else. The comments never advanced beyond breakroom conversations. No reports were filed. No audits were opened. No internal reviews were conducted. The system operated on trust, and trust was something Denise Reed had earned over many years. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, investigators were pursuing an entirely different objective. Several miles away, inside a regional narcotics task force office on Commerce Boulevard, detectives were focused on a suspected drug distribution network operating across multiple counties. The investigation had nothing to do with lawyers, at least initially. Analysts spent long hours reviewing intelligence reports, surveillance logs, arrest records, and information extracted from seized phones. Computer monitors illuminated rows of desks covered with evidence folders and handwritten notes. The objective was straightforward: identify suppliers, map associates, follow the money. During one routine intelligence review, an analyst noticed a familiar name appearing inside a communication summary connected to one of the trafficking suspects. The reference seemed insignificant, just a single mention buried among hundreds of pages. But it was unusual enough to stand out. The analyst paused, looked at the report again, then highlighted the line. The name was Denise Reed. At first, the reference appeared completely explainable. Defense attorneys frequently communicate with criminal defendants. Seeing a lawyer's name connected to a narcotics suspect was not automatically suspicious. Still, something about the context caught the analyst's attention. The mention did not appear to involve legal strategy. It appeared to involve money. The report was forwarded for additional review. Nobody realized it at the time. Nobody inside the courthouse suspected anything was wrong. And Denise Reed was still showing up to work every morning as one of Metro County's most trusted public defenders. But what started as a routine drug investigation was about to pull detectives into a place nobody expected: a public defender's office. The name Denise Reed appeared in the intelligence report almost as an afterthought. Buried between surveillance notes and intercepted communications was a brief reference that did not seem particularly important. Defense attorneys appeared in narcotics investigations all the time. Detectives regularly encountered legal correspondence, attorney visits, and discussions about retaining counsel. At first, nobody inside the Metro Regional Narcotics Task Force viewed the reference as evidence of wrongdoing. But experienced investigators are trained to pay attention to details that do not fit. The report landed on the desk of Special Agent Daniel Harper, a veteran financial crimes investigator assigned to a joint federal-state task force operating from an office complex on Commerce Boulevard. The task force had spent nearly 8 months investigating a drug trafficking organization suspected of moving cocaine and fentanyl through 3 neighboring counties. The operation involved local detectives, federal agents, financial analysts, and prosecutors working from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Every day generated more information: seized phones, bank records, license plate reader hits, search warrant returns, surveillance logs. The challenge was rarely finding evidence. The challenge was organizing it. Inside the task force office, rows of monitors displayed financial charts and communication timelines. Whiteboards covered entire walls. Detectives moved between desks carrying folders thick with subpoenas and transaction records. The constant hum of printers mixed with radio chatter and the clicking of keyboards. The investigation was slowly expanding, and Denise Reed's name kept reappearing. The first indication came from a seized cell phone belonging to suspected distributor, Terrence Coleman. Investigators recovered a series of messages discussing legal expenses. That alone was not unusual. What caught analysts' attention was the amount being discussed. One message referenced moving nearly $75,000 to cover legal costs. Another referenced additional payments through third parties. The figures appeared extraordinarily high for the type of criminal case involved. Initially, investigators assumed the messages referred to multiple defendants sharing legal expenses. Then they found another communication, and another. Each involved different suspects. Each referenced substantial legal payments. Each appeared connected to individuals represented by Black public defender Denise Reed. The pattern was difficult to ignore. Financial analyst Rebecca Collins began assembling transaction histories connected to the organization's known associates. Her job was to identify how money moved through the network. Most traffickers attempted to conceal proceeds using cash-intensive businesses, prepaid debit cards, relatives, or shell companies. The organization under investigation appeared to use all 4. Days turned into weeks as analysts reconstructed financial activity. One account led to another. then another. Transaction chains stretched across multiple states. Money moved through landscaping companies, consulting firms, transportation services, and newly formed limited liability corporations that appeared to have little legitimate business activity. Several accounts showed rapid deposits, followed by immediate transfers. Others appeared designed specifically to break large sums into smaller amounts. Nothing unusual there. Drug organizations often used those methods. The unusual part was where some of the money eventually ended up. Multiple financial pathways appeared to converge around accounts associated with Denise Reed. At first, investigators remained cautious. There were legitimate explanations. Defense attorneys often receive large retainers. Family members sometimes contribute to legal expenses. Complex criminal cases can be expensive. Nobody wanted to mistake aggressive legal representation for criminal conduct. That distinction mattered, especially when the individual involved was an officer of the court. Additional subpoenas were issued. Bank records arrived in large boxes. Analysts reviewed monthly statements line by line. They compared deposits against employment records, reviewed tax filings, cross-referenced property records, examined public financial disclosures. The deeper they looked, the less comfortable the numbers became. According to county payroll records, Reed's annual salary remained consistent with other senior public defenders. Yet several deposits appearing in her accounts seemed difficult to reconcile with that income. Individually, none looked extraordinary. Collectively, they raised questions. Some deposits originated from individuals with no obvious connection to Reed. Others appeared linked to businesses already appearing in narcotics intelligence reports. One transfer originated from a company registered to a vacant office suite. Another came from an account connected to a trucking business that investigators suspected existed only on paper. The evidence still fell short of criminal activity, but the pattern was growing. Inside weekly task force meetings, conversations began changing. Early discussions focused on whether Reed was simply receiving unusually large legal fees. Later discussions focused on why those payments appeared structured in ways that concealed their origins. There was a difference, and investigators understood it. The first major breakthrough came during a comparative analysis involving 3 separate defendants. The individuals had no direct connection to one another. Different neighborhoods, different arrests, different criminal histories. Yet financial records showed funds from each network eventually moving through intermediary accounts before arriving at destinations connected to Reed. The coincidence was difficult to explain. Special Agent Harper later described that moment as the point when curiosity became suspicion. Not certainty, not proof. Suspicion. Enough to justify additional scrutiny. Meanwhile, inside the Metro County Justice Center, life continued as normal. Denise Reed still argued motions, still negotiated plea agreements, still met clients in interview rooms illuminated by flickering fluorescent lights. Most co-workers remained unaware that her name had become a topic of discussion inside a federal task force office. That changed when investigators quietly requested employment records. The request was narrow, routine on its face, but courthouse administrators noticed. Human resources personnel received requests for payroll information, conflict disclosures, outside employment filings, and ethics documentation. Nobody said much. Government offices develop instincts about these things. People recognize when outside investigators become interested in an employee. Questions began circulating among senior administrators. Why would a narcotics task force want records related to a public defender? The answers were not immediately available, and that uncertainty created its own tension. A deputy administrator later recalled an uncomfortable meeting in which supervisors reviewed Reed's personnel file searching for obvious red flags. They found none. No disciplinary history, no ethics violations, no formal complaints. Her record appeared clean. Yet investigators kept asking questions. Back inside the task force office, analysts were reaching the same conclusion. The problem was no longer a single transaction, or a single suspect, or a single unexplained payment. It was the growing consistency of the pattern. Every new record seemed to connect to an existing thread. Every thread appeared to lead back toward the same destination, Denise Reed. But the money trail was troubling enough. Investigators soon uncovered communications that suggested the relationship between Reed and several trafficking suspects might extend far beyond legal representation. The realization arrived slowly. For months, investigators had been following money, deposits, transfers, shell companies, account activity, that seemed increasingly difficult to explain. But financial records alone could only tell part of the story. Money might suggest misconduct. Communications could reveal intent. Inside the Metro Regional Narcotics Task Force office, analysts began reviewing thousands of pages of court-authorized phone extractions, text messages, call logs, and intercepted communications connected to members of the trafficking organization. The process was tedious. Rows of computer monitors glowed late into the evening, while investigators worked through digital evidence line by line. Surveillance photos covered bulletin boards. Evidence boxes filled storage shelves. Empty coffee cups accumulated beside keyboards, as analysts searched for anything capable of explaining why so much money appeared to be flowing toward Black public defender Denise Reed. At first, the communications seemed ordinary. Clients discussing court dates, family members talking about bond money, conversations about plea offers and legal representation. Nothing unusual. Then investigators started noticing language patterns. Certain names appeared repeatedly. Certain phrases surfaced across multiple conversations, and several discussions appeared to reference financial transactions using coded terminology. One recurring phrase involved moving paperwork. Another referred to cleaning files. A third referenced the office taking care of it. Individually, the messages meant very little. Taken together, they created concern, especially because the communications frequently involved individuals represented by Denise Reed. Federal prosecutors remained cautious. Attorney-client relationships carry legal protections for good reason. Defense attorneys regularly communicate with criminal suspects. They handle money for legitimate legal purposes. They meet privately with clients. None of that is criminal. The challenge facing investigators was determining whether Reed's conduct remained within those professional boundaries, or whether it crossed them. As analysts expanded their review, attention shifted toward in-person meetings. Several surveillance teams had already documented encounters involving members of the trafficking organization. Initially, those observations were collected as part of the broader narcotics investigation. Now investigators began re-examining them through a different lens. One report described a meeting at a restaurant near Jefferson Avenue and South Market Street. The encounter occurred on a Tuesday evening shortly after 9 p.m. Denise Reed arrived alone. A suspected narcotics distributor arrived separately approximately 10 minutes later. The meeting lasted less than 20 minutes. According to surveillance notes, no food was ordered. No visible legal documents were exchanged. The two spoke briefly before departing in different directions. Again, not evidence of a crime, but it raised questions. A second encounter occurred inside a parking garage adjacent to a commercial office complex. Surveillance teams observed Reed meeting another individual under active narcotics investigation. The interaction lasted only a few minutes. Detectives noted what appeared to be an exchange of envelopes. The footage lacked sufficient detail to determine the contents. The observation was documented and filed. At the time, investigators had no reason to view it as significant. Months later, it became part of a much larger picture. Additional meetings followed. Coffee shops, private offices, business parking lots, locations that seemed inconsistent with routine attorney-client consultations. The pattern did not prove wrongdoing, but it did suggest that some interactions were occurring outside traditional legal settings. As surveillance logs accumulated, investigators noticed another detail. Several individuals connected to the trafficking organization appeared to maintain unusually frequent contact with Reed, despite having no active court appearances scheduled. Phone records showed communication continuing during periods when legal activity appeared minimal. The timing attracted attention. The content remained largely unknown, but investigators began documenting every contact. The case took another turn when prosecutors secured cooperation from two individuals facing federal narcotics charges. Neither witness initially mentioned Reed. That changed during follow-up interviews. Inside a federal interview room illuminated by fluorescent lights and monitored by recording equipment, investigators asked detailed questions about financial operations within the TUM trafficking organization. One witness described efforts to move money through third parties. Another discussed using legitimate businesses to disguise the origins of cash. Then Denise Reed's name surfaced. According to interview summaries, both witnesses claimed certain financial transactions had been structured specifically to create distance between criminal proceeds and their ultimate destination. The allegations were significant, but they presented another problem. Witnesses facing criminal charges often have incentives to cooperate. Their statements require corroboration. Investigators could not simply accept the claims as fact. Every allegation needed independent verification. That verification process consumed weeks. Agents compared interview statements against financial records, meeting logs, phone data, travel histories, banking activity. Some claims failed to hold up. Others appeared surprisingly consistent with existing evidence. The deeper investigators looked, the more difficult it became to dismiss the possibility that Denise Reed occupied a role extending beyond legal representation. Still, proving criminal intent remained extraordinarily difficult. Defense attorneys frequently receive money from clients and their associates. They communicate outside courtrooms. They meet privately. The distinction between lawful legal services and criminal participation often depends on intent, knowledge, and actions hidden beneath otherwise ordinary behavior. Prosecutors understood that reality. So did investigators. No one wanted to bring allegations against a public defender without overwhelming evidence. The professional consequences would be enormous. The public consequences could be worse. By late summer, discussions were no longer confined to the task force office. Senior prosecutors began quietly evaluating potential exposure. Internal memoranda circulated among supervisors. Meetings occurred behind closed conference room doors. Questions emerged about ongoing criminal cases handled by Reed. What if the allegations became public? What if defense counsel herself became the subject of prosecution? The potential fallout stretched far beyond one attorney. Judges could face disclosure obligations. Convictions might be challenged. Active investigations could be affected. The possibility of corruption inside the justice system carried consequences that reached every corner of the courthouse. Meanwhile, Denise Reed continued appearing in court. She argued motions, met clients, walked through the same security checkpoint each morning. To outside observers, nothing appeared different. But behind the scenes, investigators were assembling pieces of a puzzle that seemed increasingly difficult to ignore. Financial records suggested a pattern. Communications hinted at hidden relationships. Witnesses described arrangements that extended beyond legal advocacy. Surveillance logs placed key individuals together repeatedly. Each piece alone was incomplete. Together, they pointed toward something larger, something investigators still could not fully prove. Then they obtained surveillance footage that connected every piece of the puzzle together. The surveillance footage did not arrive with dramatic music or a clear confession. Like most evidence in complex financial investigations, it arrived quietly, stored inside a digital evidence database, buried among hundreds of hours of recordings collected over nearly a year. But when investigators finally viewed the footage alongside financial records, communication logs, witness statements, and transaction histories, something changed. For the first time, the separate pieces of the investigation began aligning. Inside the Metro Regional Narcotics Task Force office, analysts constructed detailed timelines stretching across entire conference room walls. Surveillance still images sat beside bank records. Phone logs were compared against wire transfers. Meeting locations were plotted against financial activity. The objective was simple: determine whether the transactions investigators had identified could be connected to specific events and specific people. What they discovered significantly strengthened the case. One surveillance sequence captured a meeting between Black public defender Denise Reed and a suspected trafficking associate at a commercial plaza near Riverside Parkway. The encounter lasted less than 15 minutes. Nothing about the interaction appeared illegal on its face. But investigators noticed what happened afterward. Within hours of the meeting, a series of deposits appeared in accounts already connected to the financial network under investigation. Those funds moved again the following day. Then again. By the end of the week, portions of the money had been distributed through multiple intermediary accounts. The timing matched too closely to ignore. Analysts began searching for additional examples. They found several: meetings followed by deposits, deposits followed by transfers, transfers followed by withdrawals. Each event appeared isolated when viewed independently. Together, they formed a pattern. As prosecutors reviewed the evidence, investigators prepared applications for additional search warrants. The requests were extensive. Federal magistrates were presented with financial analyses, witness statements, surveillance summaries, communication records, and transaction mapping reports compiled over months of investigative work. The warrants authorized access to multiple categories of evidence: banking records, electronic devices, business documentation, financial storage records, property transaction files, digital communication platforms. The investigation was entering a new phase. At dawn on a Tuesday morning, Teams executed coordinated search warrants across several locations. Agents arrived carrying evidence collection kits and sealed warrant packets. Body cameras recorded each step. Supervisors coordinated movements over encrypted radio channels. One team focused on financial institutions and records repositories. Another executed warrants involving electronic data. A third handled locations associated with business entities already appearing throughout the investigation. The process was methodical. Evidence technicians photographed everything before collection. Documents were cataloged. Electronic devices were secured. Chain of custody forms accompanied every item removed. Investigators understood that complex financial cases are often won or lost on documentation. Nothing could be rushed. Among the material recovered were years of banking records and financial documents that investigators believed would help explain how money had moved through the network. Forensic accountants immediately began reviewing the information. Unlike traditional investigators, forensic accountants often spend months reconstructing financial histories one transaction at a time. The work is painstaking. Every deposit is examined. Every withdrawal is tracked. Every transfer is documented. Investigators referred to the process as following the money through layers. The concept was straightforward. Money rarely travels directly from criminal activity to its final destination. Instead, it is often moved through multiple accounts, businesses, and transactions designed to obscure its origin. According to investigative findings, several financial pathways appeared to follow that exact pattern. Wire transfers became one of the most important categories of evidence. Records showed funds moving between accounts connected to individuals already identified in the narcotics investigation. Those funds frequently passed through intermediary entities before arriving elsewhere. Some transfers involved amounts just below reporting thresholds. Others appeared divided into smaller transactions spread across multiple dates. Forensic analysts created visual charts illustrating the movement. The diagrams stretched across entire presentation boards. What once looked like isolated transactions now resembled an interconnected system. Bank deposits provided another critical layer. Investigators compared deposit activity against employment records, tax filings, and documented income sources. Several deposits appeared difficult to reconcile with known earnings. Additional scrutiny focused on cash withdrawals. Large withdrawals were often followed by periods of limited account activity. Then money would reappear elsewhere. The movement was complex, but increasingly traceable. Digital communications added context. Recovered messages, contact logs, scheduling information, and electronic records helped investigators understand when certain interactions occurred and who appeared involved. Some communications aligned closely with financial activity already identified by analysts. Others matched surveillance observations collected months earlier. Business records produced additional concerns. Several entities that appeared repeatedly in financial transactions showed minimal evidence of legitimate operations. Some maintained limited physical presence. Others generated little documented revenue despite significant account activity. Property purchases also attracted attention. Investigators reviewed acquisition records, financing documents, and ownership histories associated with individuals appearing throughout the investigation. Certain transactions raised questions about the true source of funds used to acquire assets. None of these categories independently proved criminal conduct. Together, however, they strengthened a growing argument. The evidence was no longer pointing toward isolated coincidences. It was pointing toward coordination. Inside weekly case briefings, conversations changed noticeably. Early meetings focused on possibilities. Later meetings focused on probable cause. The distinction mattered. Investigators no longer debated whether the patterns existed. They debated whether the evidence was sufficient to support criminal charges. Meanwhile, inside the Metro County Justice Center, concern was spreading. Senior administrators became aware that the investigation had progressed beyond preliminary inquiries. Confidential meetings were held between courthouse leadership, ethics officials, and legal advisors. Personnel records were reviewed. Disclosure requirements were discussed. Contingency plans were drafted. The possibility that a respected public defender could become the target of a major corruption case forced administrators into unfamiliar territory. Judges quietly began examining active cases handled by Denise Reed. Prosecutors reviewed files for potential conflicts. Questions emerged regarding whether pending criminal matters could be affected by future developments. No one wanted to speculate publicly, but the concern was unmistakable. What began as a narcotics investigation had evolved into something capable of shaking confidence in the local justice system itself. Throughout this period, Denise Reed continued appearing in court. Observers later recalled nothing unusual about her behavior. She remained composed, professional, measured. She argued motions, met clients, filed paperwork. To most people around her, life appeared unchanged. But behind the scenes, investigators were assembling what they believed was the strongest phase of evidence collected during the entire inquiry. Months of surveillance, thousands of financial transactions, search warrant returns, digital communications, witness testimony, business records, property data, forensic accounting analysis. The evidence was finally being viewed as a single narrative rather than separate pieces, and that narrative appeared increasingly difficult to explain away. By the end of the investigation's 11th month, prosecutors and agents gathered inside a secure conference room to review the final presentation. The room was quiet. A projector displayed transaction maps across one wall. Evidence binders covered the table. When the briefing ended, investigators believed they had crossed the threshold they had been working toward for nearly a year. After nearly a year of evidence gathering, investigators believed they had enough. The arrest was finally approved. The arrest generated headlines. The trial generated answers. Within weeks of Denise Reed's initial court appearance, prosecutors began turning thousands of pages of evidence over to the defense. Financial spreadsheets, surveillance reports, bank records, search warrant returns, digital communications, and witness interview summaries filled storage drives and evidence binders. The volume alone illustrated how extensive the investigation had become. Inside the federal courthouse on Franklin Street, pretrial hearings quickly turned into a battle over interpretation. The defense did not dispute that money had moved through various accounts. Instead, attorneys argued that investigators had built an assumption and then searched for evidence to support it. Their position was straightforward. Denise Reed had represented high-risk criminal defendants for years. Complex legal matters often involve unusual payment arrangements. Large legal fees are not crimes. Meeting clients outside a courtroom is not a crime. Communicating with defendants is not a crime. The government, they argued, was confusing legal representation with criminal participation. Prosecutors disagreed. According to court filings, the issue was not whether Reed represented criminal suspects. The issue was whether she knowingly assisted in concealing the origin of criminal proceeds. That distinction would become the center of the trial. Months later, jury selection began. Reporters filled the gallery. Former co-workers occupied benches near the rear of the courtroom. Members of the public waited in line outside security screening checkpoints hoping to observe portions of the proceedings. The case had become one of the most closely watched public corruption prosecutions in recent Greene County history. Black public defender Denise Reed entered the courtroom each day wearing dark business attire and maintaining the same calm demeanor many people remembered from her years as a defense attorney. Observers noted that she rarely displayed visible emotion, but the consequences surrounding her were becoming impossible to ignore. Prosecutors opened their case by presenting a timeline. Projected across courtroom screens were charts tracing financial activity across months of transactions. Jurors watched as investigators explained how money allegedly moved through intermediary accounts, shell entities, and layered transfers before arriving at destinations connected to Reed. The presentation lasted days. Forensic accountants walked jurors through wire transfers. Banking specialists explained reporting requirements. Financial analysts described transaction patterns they believed were inconsistent with legitimate legal fees. One witness compared the process to reconstructing a river by examining thousands of mounds individual drops of water. No single transaction proved everything. The significance emerged from the pattern. Surveillance evidence followed. Investigators testified about meetings documented throughout the inquiry. Videos showed encounters occurring in parking lots, commercial properties, and locations outside traditional legal settings. Jurors reviewed timestamps, travel records, communication logs. The government argued that the interactions demonstrated coordination. The defense argued they demonstrated nothing more than attorney-client relationships. Both sides understood the importance of context. Former clients took the witness stand. Some described routine legal representation. Others provided testimony prosecutors believed supported their theory of the case. Several cooperating witnesses offered detailed accounts regarding financial arrangements inside the trafficking organization. Defense attorneys challenged their credibility aggressively. Each witness faced questions regarding plea agreements, criminal histories, and motivations to cooperate. The exchanges were tense but measured. At times, the courtroom fell silent as jurors listened to competing versions of the same events. The government presented records. The defense questioned interpretations. Neither side gave ground easily. Perhaps the most damaging testimony came from financial experts. Using visual exhibits, they demonstrated how funds allegedly moved through multiple layers before reaching accounts connected to Reed. The charts appeared complex. The explanation did not. According to prosecutors, the structure existed for one purpose: to disguise where the money came from. The defense responded with experts of their own. They argued that complex financial activity does not automatically indicate criminal intent. Alternative explanations existed, coincidences existed, assumptions existed, and they reminded jurors that suspicion is not proof. The trial lasted several weeks. By the time closing arguments arrived, the evidence had transformed a respected attorney into the central figure of a corruption case viewed across the region. Years of professional credibility were now being examined through the lens of criminal allegations. For many observers, that collapse proved difficult to watch. Former colleagues described feeling conflicted. Some believed the evidence. Others struggled to reconcile the accusations with the person they thought they knew. The jury eventually received instructions and retired to deliberate. The waiting began. Inside the courthouse, attorneys paced hallways. Reporters monitored updates. Family members sat quietly in public areas near the courtroom. Hours turned into days. Every passing moment increased uncertainty. Then the jury returned. Courtroom chairs shifted as people stood. The foreperson handed the verdict form to the clerk. The room remained silent. One count after another was read into the record. The jury found Denise Reed guilty on multiple charges related to money laundering and financial conspiracy allegations. Observers later recalled Reed remaining largely expressionless. The verdict marked the end of the trial. It did not mark the end of the consequences. Several months later, sentencing proceedings began. Prosecutors argued that the conduct represented a profound breach of public trust. They emphasized Reed's position as an attorney and officer of the court. The damage, they argued, extended beyond financial transactions. It affected confidence in the justice system itself. Defense counsel urged the court to consider Reed's years of public service, lack of prior criminal history, and professional accomplishments. Family members submitted letters. Former colleagues submitted statements. The court reviewed extensive documentation before imposing sentence. When the hearing concluded, the consequences became official. Reed faced incarceration, financial penalties, supervised release requirements, and permanent professional damage. Separate disciplinary proceedings moved forward through the state bar system. Her law license was suspended pending further action. Disbarment proceedings followed. The career she had spent more than a decade building effectively ended. Beyond the individual case, the investigation exposed broader institutional concerns. Internal reviews examined oversight procedures. Ethics policies were updated. Financial disclosure requirements received additional scrutiny. Training programs expanded. Administrators sought to identify whether warning signs had been overlooked. Many concluded that the system had relied heavily on trust and not enough on verification. The courthouse eventually returned to normal operations. New attorneys assumed old caseloads. New cases filled court calendars. The daily routines continued, but the scandal left a lasting mark. Years after the verdict, people inside metro counties, legal communities still reference the case when discussing ethics, accountability, and public trust, because the most unsettling aspect of the investigation was never the complexity of the financial evidence. It was the identity of the person at the center of it. Denise Reed was not a trafficker. She was not a gang leader. She was not someone expected to operate outside the law. She was a public defender, a professional entrusted with protecting constitutional rights and preserving confidence in the justice system. And according to the findings that emerged in court, that trust became the very thing investigators believed had been exploited. The drug traffickers were expected to break the law. The public defender was expected to defend it. And for many people, that betrayal became the most shocking part of the entire case.